depends. So some
when we try to change the color, when we said change color and that's first update, first update. So I want to know, it doesn't matter if the way we create like into apps, GSX.
So that's all going to depend on what you're doing with that code and that function, right? The reason I put it at this level right now is just because, well, there's a couple reasons why it exists here. One is because I have the button here, and so I can't put it inside of like my notes file or somewhere else unless I could create a whole different file and import it. But the other reason is also just because one thing that this does is called this.force update. So this needs to be somewhere in one of our React components above the notes. And that's just because of the way that we're changing colors right now, is every time we render our notes, they get a random color. So somewhere in our React tree above that, we need to have this function, this method, and this is above that, so it works just fine being there. It could also, we could have done this whole thing inside of like this notes section as a whole. We could have done it here, which also could have, instead of just rendering the list of notes, we could have added a button here and rendered it there, and then had change color as part of this notes component. But I just put it up at the top level for a couple reasons. One is because it was just easier to have it at the top level. Think about the button up there, because the button doesn't really belong to the notes. And also because I knew ahead of time, I'm cheating. I know ahead of time I want to manage my state. I want to change the state instead of just changing the other stuff. And the state for my notes is managed at the app level. So since I want the action to change this state, and that state is at this app level, then that action needs to exist either here or somewhere higher up the chain in order to change that state. So I couldn't put it inside of notes because that doesn't have access to this state to change it anymore. Only the app has access to this state. So that's why change colors exists in the app right now, is because I know eventually, we haven't done it yet, but I know we're gonna wanna change the state as part of this. And so I put it right where that same state was, so they live side by side. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So yeah, one of the problems right now, there's no real connection between change colors and what's happening. But let's just jump down and show what's going on here, so that for anyone who missed the class, is inside of our notes that renders all of our notes, we have a function that we just borrowed straight from the link in the PDF that gets you a random color. So all I did was steal some of that code and just return the value of it, which is just a random hexadecimal color. And then inside of our notes component, for each note that it renders, it calls getRandomColor and assigns that to a color for the note. So that's how each one gets a random color. That's how they're getting values. So we create a color property that's random every time our notes render. And then it's very simple. Inside of the note itself, the only thing we have is we take that color property and we just assign it to the color attribute in style. So that's just CSS. So if we went and looked at like a CSS reference and we looked at color, you can see the color CSS property sets the foreground color of an element's text. So that's all that's happening there, is I took that color property that we'd passed in and just converted into CSS, but inline CSS using the style tag. But you can see, if we look at this, why there's this disconnect. What did force update do that changed our colors? The only thing it did was cause notes to re-render. And when notes re-renders, it gets a new random color for every one of our notes, so the colors change. But there's not really an explicit connection there between clicking the button and changing the colors, right? If we look at our function, This doesn't really change the colors. Something else sort of coincidentally changes the colors. So maybe we can, do this a different way instead, right? And one thing that we can do that makes a lot of sense is, oh yeah, before we go down that route, hold on. I did say I want to do this button bit. So I'm going to pause there for a second. And we're going to come down the route of changing the state instead. But collectively, let's say, okay, well, we created this button component that's really nice and easy to use to render our button. And we have a handle click, on click type thing. But we're also rendering a bare HTML button right here, right? Well, maybe we can just replace that. So everything that we render as a button in our application is the same thing. And that way, if we change our button behavior, we change it for everything at once. So let's take a look real fast at that. I wish I could do side by side. There's got to be a way to do side by side. Vertical split. So no, wrong. Go away. I can't get rid of you, can I? Horizontal split. There we go. All right. Oops. So over here, let's put our button over here for a second. This is something that's useful sometimes in editors where you want to look at a couple different pieces of code at the same time to help you think about them both and how they're related. A lot of editors let you do something like this where you can sort of split and see two things side by side. So if we were to look at our buttons here, what's different between these two that we might need to change the behavior of in order to be able to use this same button component in both cases? The name of the file? Is there anything else different? All right, let's try this. So you're saying, what if we just render this as a button, an uppercase button? All right, let's see what happens in our app now. So it compiled. What happened?
Yes, two new colors.
Two components of the button.
Okay. What happens when we click this one? It's okay. So can you tell me what's different between them right now?
What's different between your .jsx and the method button?
Well, this one is using the button component correctly, right? But this one before, look, I typed the whole thing out instead of just changing one letter. Isn't that silly of me? This thing is using the direct HTML component, right? Now, if we want to change it to use this button component instead of an HTML element, what's different between how what this component expects and what this button element is currently doing that we might need to change? Like, how can we change our button component to support rendering both of these? Add another button. So like here. In the button.jsx. Oh, but what I'm getting at here is I don't want to add another one. I want to use this same component more than once. Like I want to do this. I want to say button on click. I want to use this for every button that I want. This dot jump, like I don't know what all my buttons are going to do, right? And I want to reuse this same button each time.
You should be able to pass in the button label.
That's something different, right? I'm not passing a label into this guy, but this guy has text sort of in the middle. It's sort of hidden there, right? This plus sign is what's being rendered. And what's happening on this guy is I have text that I've hard-coded into it, right? So maybe if instead of hard coding it, I pass a label in. So that's, we can do this a few different ways. There's not one way to do this. So you could either pass a label in, which is what we'll do right now, and I can show you another alternative as well. So let's say we pass a label in. This one's new colors. That looks fine. All right, so let's try and change this component now to use that label for its text. Yeah, we can do it. We can do it with the props.label directly here. You know, I've been doing the typical pattern of something like this. Props.label. And there's no right way to do this. A lot of people will just inline it as props.label. And in this case, since this is a function component as opposed to a class, you don't have the this dot. It's just props that are passed in directly. But we can say label instead. So now what we do is we go and check our app. And we'll see. I don't know.
Can you adjust the screen so?
Something didn't work. What's that?
Can you adjust the screen because on the page, like the left part of the screen is like chopped off.
You want me to move this over or you know
Like,
this?
all the way, so, like the whole screen, the whole Chrome tab.
It's showing screen.
Like,
wait.
go to Kanban demo.
What are you guys missing here?
Go over to the Kanban demo page.
You mean over, oh.
All the way to the left of your screen.
Yeah.
Can't see.
Oh, you guys aren't seeing it. Hold on. So what are you guys seeing on here? How much of this is getting chopped off? No, you guys are losing some.
Just a little bit.
Let me see if I can fix this.
The X.
This is a setting problem on the. Let me check something here. Let me try this. It's still chopping off. There we go. All right. Everything's really huge though. Give me a minute. Is that too small? Good. All right. Get a little less on the screen, but that'll work. Okay. So something didn't quite work right here. I don't know what it is. Var label was props.label. Here I tried to render the label directly in here. Oh, you know what? I didn't save my app.jsx file. So I wasn't passing a label in. All right, so let's check our demo now. That looks good, right? So now it looks like we have the pieces of information we need to convert this because this is our label or whatever, right? So let's try and make the change. Let's change this, and I don't even need the closing element anymore because I can just say label equals plus. And sure enough, it looks like our two buttons are both working the same way now and using the same component. So we sort of, once we had this component, we were like, well, maybe we don't want to have just the plain buttons. And that might be because maybe we want to change some of this behavior. Maybe we want every button, the area around the button to have some padding. So let's, you don't need to follow this, but let's give it some like margin. Like let's say margin of 10 pixels, you know, whatever, around our buttons. And what happened is both of these got that same behavior because they're using that same component. And that's one of the benefits of reusing a component is you can have consistent behavior throughout your app very easily. You know, let's say we want to change something else about it. I don't know what else we're gonna want to change. Let's give them a min width of 30, and that might not be, oh, it won't change the button width. We could change the button width and give it a minimum width as well. You know, or we could add in some shared text for everything. So now everything, it's very easy when you're using this sort of component model and everything that's the same is using that component to change the behavior for all of them consistently in different ways. So I'll leave some margin on there because I think it looks better. Are people comfortable with what we did there with using the button? So now let's go revisit what we were doing before. All right, I don't need a split right now. We might bring it back later. Let's talk about how can we change the way this change colors works so that instead of it's just forcing an update and us having some implicit color change here, we can actually change the colors of our notes and, you know, have it make sense of what's going on in this change colors action. Does anybody have an idea or strategy for that, where we can go?
We have to use set state at some point so we can update state.
All right, so what you're saying is to step up a level, right, from explicitly implementing it, let's step up to the concept. You're saying, well, we're storing the state of our notes. We're storing our notes here in state. So what we want to do is add a color or something to each note here. And when I click that change colors button, I want to change what that color is. Right? So that's sort of breaking down, like not getting stuck on exactly how I'll do it, but it makes sense, right? I want to change these items and then use that farther down. All right. Any ideas on the first step for that?
Maybe you could start by adding colors of the two notes already in there.
Like that, right? Start with something small. Let's see if we can get a color off of these and render it, and then we'll see what happens, right? So let's add a color, and let's just give them, I'm just going to put some colors in here directly for the time being. We can have sort of a red versus blue bit. All right, so we've added colors to our notes when we create them, but this color value isn't being used anywhere, right? So let's step over here. Now maybe, what's that? This code's a little dense again, and so it might be useful to break it down.
Can you just add it on the map?
Yeah,
You can just structure it.
that's where this stuff, like I said, can be a little dense because this notes.map, and we talked about this once, but this is iterating over each note in the notes here that get passed down into our notes as a property. And it calls this function here for each one of those notes, passing in the note as the first argument. And then it's doing this dereferencing to pull off some properties of that note, which before were ID and task. But now we have another property that we want to pull off, right? I also want color. So I'll leave it with this syntax, and if it's too confusing, let me know and we can rewrite it into something more verbose, more clear. So we've got a color that we're now passing into this function. Now, do we have a note that's already taking a color somewhere that we can just use that at? What can we change in here to use that color parameter for the note color.
Put in the color. Or get random color.
Right now we're assigning a color to our notes, but we can, or we're just getting a random one, but we can easily just change it to use this color argument for our function, right? And we can go over here and take a look and let's see what happens. Might not be working. We'll see. There we go. So we're getting our colors. So that's great because we broke it down to a very simple first problem, at least compared to trying to solve the whole thing. What we said is, well, we're going to want to change this state and set some colors. So let's just make sure that we can use a value off of there right now already to render our colors, right? So that's that process of breaking a problem down, thinking about it in these smaller and smaller pieces until you've got a piece that you can tackle, and then you tackle that, and then you can move on to the next one. So what would be the next step on this? We know we can do this, so generate a random color, and we need to do it here in the app.jsx, right? So let's go grab that function that we have over here to get our random color. We could export it from our notes here if we wanted as an option, but I'm just going to move it because nobody's relying on it. It wasn't already being exported, so there's no danger in just putting it in here directly. So let's just move that function over here because this is where it's going to be used now. There's no harm in that. So now we could, even here, if we want to now, we could do random colors when we first create these guys. When we first set up our initial ones. And now we can sort of test that, but it's going to be very heavy because we have to fully refresh the app every time to change our colors. But we're getting one initially. And if we click our change color button, does anything happen? It doesn't. Do people understand? The question I would have here is, do you understand why that's not changing the colors?
Because the button that is responsible for that action, it's not getting that get random color. Has to do it. It's a process.
Yeah, because right now, when we click that change color button, all that it does is force an update. So it just re-renders, but our state didn't change at all. So it re-renders with the exact same state, which means these guys will have the exact same colors. So maybe what do we want to, what's our next action here then to try and, we're building this problem up. Set the state. So let's go ahead and figure out how we're going to change our state somehow, right? I'm going to break this down into smaller pieces because there's several bits to making this work very easily. First, let's get our existing notes, right? Let's pull them out of our state. Equals this dot state dot notes. Because we know we have notes in our state. And so now notes will be a array of notes, right? Array of objects. So the next thing we want to do, anybody? We have an array of our notes.
Iterate.
What?
Iterate over each one.
Iterate over each one, right? So step over each one. And we can do that anyway. If anybody wants to, like, we've done this a lot of different ways. How can we step over each item in an array?
Can we use the map?
We can use map. Does anybody have a different approach? Like we could use a for loop, right? Because we've written for loops.
There are 4 each.
There is a for each, I believe, yeah, that we could use. So are people comfortable with any one of those you're going to be more comfortable with? No?
I think the map.
All right.
We're already using that.
So let's try map. So when you're doing a mapping, let's take a quick look. What does a map do here, right? In array.map, wow, this is huge. The map method creates a new array with the result of calling a provided function on every element in the calling array. All right. So if I'm reading that, then what that tells me is, and if I look at this example, I need to assign my new array into a variable. So let's create a new notes or new colored notes. And then, all right, let's go look at this example again. So what I need to do is the original array that I had, whatever it is, dot map. So that's notes dot map. And then that's a function. And what do I pass into that function? A callback, some other function. So I give it a function, and what it's going to do is call that function with the current value of the array as it steps through. So it'll call it with each item in the array. It'll also pass in the index and the whole array in case we want it for some reason. So let's go ahead and let's write this function. And again, I like to break stuff down very heavily, right? So var change note color equals, and we'll just, this is a function of some kind, and it's going to take a note and return
Oh, that color.
Return an object with the note ID and the new color.
to return an object with the note ID and the new color. So let's try this. Let's do a return. Well, you know what? We took the note, so let's change the color on that note, right? What's the property for the color? It's just color, right? So let's get a random color. Oops. And then we can return our notes now. Because we took in the note, we changed the color on it, the object, and then we return this object with the changed color. Now this is not probably the ideal way to write this. There's a subtle thing that can go wrong with this because we're actually mutating the same object. But in this case, it's pretty simple. You're not probably going to get burned by this. So I'm not worried about it right now. The fact that we're changing this note under the covers. So does that seem like a very straightforward function, right? Yeah. And now what we can do is notes.map, just call change note color. Oops. So we'll pass in that function. And what it's going to do is call that for every one of our notes and create a new array with our notes and the colors changed on them. So let's, this is an area where we could do some console logs or something if we wanted to test this after we've just done a few lines of code. Or we might even be able to test our little change note color function if we wanted to. But let's just try and work through the rest of this and we'll see. And we'll probably have something wrong at this point. So does anybody remember how we update the state for a component when we need to update it? We've got some examples here, right? If we're not sure, here to add a note, what we do is we take our existing, check on that real fast. Yeah, everything's fine. We take our existing state and or a new state, and we say, oh, a new state will have notes, which are all of the notes that we had plus another one, right? So really all we're doing here is creating a state object that we want to add to our state to change it somehow. And anything that has the same name as something already in that state, which in this case notes, it's going to overwrite that. So, all right, how do we actually make that change? Well, here's our call of set state, which took the new state as its first parameter. And we don't really care about the second one. We don't need to do something special when the state changes. So then we could do that same thing here, where we could have a new state if we want. And that state could be an object of some kind that has a notes array, and that notes array in this case can be assigned to just the new colored notes, because that's just a new R array, right? And now we can actually set the state. This dot set state, and pass in our state that we want to set. I'm going to get rid of this force update because we were just doing that because we didn't have another way to set the state. Now we're doing it sort of explicitly here. And this is when the rubber meets the road and we get to see how I did something wrong. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm sure it's there. I'm so confident I'll open up the inspector here and expect to see some error of some kind or something. Yep. Oh. Yes. Feeling good. Feeling good. Is there any confusion over how that's working? Any questions?
Just a little bit on the set state.
Yeah, I can understand that. Set state in React does something, they sort of mix objects together. So if we had, let's create a really simple object up here, right? We've used our hero before, so we'll have a hero of some kind. And let's give him a name. So it's the name for our hero.
What's the name?
What?
Oh, Black Panther.
Black Panther. All right, yeah, that's right. I like it. And what else? I mean, they'll have a real name too, and I don't know the real name. Does anybody know the real name? Unknown. This person has a great cover. All right, and then let's give them some like abilities or something, right? And this is going to be an object as well. So what are some speed? Like, I don't know. We're rated out of like 100 or something. His speed is like, you know, he's fast but not super fast. He's not like the Flash or something. So he's like 60. Strength. I don't know. He's pretty strong. Like, you know, like again, like, let's go 65, relatively strong, but agility is like really agile. So that's like 95 or something. And so when you're doing set state in React, what it'll actually do is sort of mix in a new object into your state. So if we imagine that this is a state of all of React that we have, and we're going to try and mix something new in, like, let's say we learned his real name, which I don't know what it is.
CHALL.
Yeah, I think you're right. So let's say we sort of learn this, right? Now in normal code, if you were to say like replace this object with this, or say, oh, this, what used to point to that now points to this, you would lose all your other state here. Like you would lose your name and your abilities. Because they're two different objects in a sense, right? But what set state does in React to a level, or at least as best as it can, is it will if you pass this in, like this dot set state, because this other one was your old state. And this is your new object, then what it'll try and do is iterate over the items in this and only replace the ones that are new here, but keep the rest of your state. And then that'll be your new state. So instead of losing name and abilities entirely, it'll just replace, create a new object, but I'm lazy and don't have room here. And that new object will have the one property that you changed didn't change, but everything else will still be there. And that's sort of what React.setState does. It does this sort of mix in of one object into another one. Now that gets complicated if, say, in abilities we had another object inside of it, right? Like one of these was more complex and it was also an object, so we're nested down. And then over here, we passed in a new set of abilities. It's not going to mix in all the way down. Your whole abilities object at that top level is going to get replaced. But at the top level or whatever, it'll mix it in as best as it can. I don't know if that helps explain a little bit of what it's doing. Let me turn my phone off. My friends are talking about games. Then you're all are as geeky as me. I play collectible card games. All right. Does that make a little more sense on the set state and what's going on there, Jorge?
Yeah.
Yeah? So does this make sense for the most part? When we work through here, still a little confusion? Any specific areas?
You go back to the code.
Yeah. All right. So, yeah, I mean, if there's any confusion or questions, ask them on Slack and stuff, follow up. Let's try and get any clarity we can on different stuff. But I think that's worked through what I think is a really nice solution to this, like changing colors problem. And we're managing it in the state now. So now if we look at, if you went and looked at the change colors function or method on this component, you can really see what it's doing. As before, there was this very loose coupling, like it made no sense why force update should change the colors just looking at that. But now you understand what's going on. Oh, I'm changing the colors of my notes. That's exactly what I'm doing.
Sure. We never did anything with the add new notes function. It doesn't get a color when it's added.
Ah, that's a good catch, right? We've got a problem right now. Our notes don't have colors when we've added them, right? So they're all just black because there's no color. So maybe we want to go change that. And that's what you're going to catch when you're doing debugging of your code or somebody's testing it.
Well, what happens if you put new colors down? Well,
What's going to happen? I think it's going to be okay. And then they're magically going to get a color because it didn't check to see if they had a color before. So then we could decide, like, right, we may have, this may be much more complex. Like maybe we only want to change the color if it already has a color. Maybe if that object didn't have a color, that item in the array didn't have one, we don't want to change the color. Or maybe we want to add a color when we add a new note, and so we need to have that as part of our new note action, right? Instead of just here, we can add it up here in our add note section. There's a lot of different possibilities and options there. You know, there's not one way to solve that problem, and that's where you may actually, like if you're doing this application for a job and somebody has asked you to go build this and you're, okay, I'm creating notes and oh yeah, I want them to have, you know, I want the notes that are in there to render with random colors, and then you've got this add note button and those should, you know, be black, and when you add a new note, you may have to go back to them at that point and say, okay, well, we've got a bit of code now that changes colors, but do you want us to change the color of new notes or only the ones that had a color explicitly set? That's part of the conversation and figuring out how to build the application. You don't always know what somebody's looking for. They may say, oh no, I only wanted high priority notes to have a different color, and I want those ones to be red and normal ones to be black. And you go, oh man, we've got to change the way this is built a little bit. We need to now add an ability to make a note high priority or low priority, as opposed to just, you know, a note. And that's the concept of just negotiating and figuring out the scope and the design of what you're building. And when you're doing that, you know, a lot of times the developer is asking those questions, but there's also people in the software development lifecycle who maybe aren't a developer. So you may have a project manager or a product owner, and that person might be the one working with the developers and then going back to the people who are asking for the feature to find out, sort of liaisoning between the two, figuring out how to build it correctly and what it's actually going to cost. So there's a lot of other roles that aren't direct software development when you're building products. Yeah, so we could do, you know, anything there, but there's not one right way to have done that. All right, so I want to let's go ahead and move on, and let's talk about the idea of controlled components. So who's at least gotten to the editing notes section, at least looked over it so far? Good number of the class. Did the concept of controlled versus uncontrolled, did that make sense as to what's going on? Because I feel like he sort of glossed over it and didn't dig in the way I would expect. Because to me, this was an interesting concept when I encountered it in React, and I struggled with it a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and try and give you guys some examples of the difference between them so that it might make sense as to what's going on here. So let's take this code, and I am git checkout. Uh-oh. Oh, I need to do -b. We got some nice Christmas music rocking behind us. All right. So I like where my files are right now. So I'm going to, now let me check my status. It looks like everything's in there. So git commit -m for my message. Added a color changing button. All right. Now I'm just going to build this branch right off of this one anyways. I'm going to create another branch because I want to start with this code, and let's call it controlled. I'm lazy, I don't want to type more, so controlled. All right, so right up here in between this and the buttons, I'm going to add can I just do an input directly? Let me see what React has here as their reference example. I can. I'm going to steal this. Copying and pasting is fine. Just don't copy and paste all over the place in your code because you're going to have to make the same change everywhere. All right, so this is just getting a text input. And I'm going to start it with no value. And I'm actually going to get rid of this onChange bit right now. So I've just added a text input to the app. That's really all I've done, which is just a place where you can type something and your changes will show up. And that's not working. My changes aren't showing up when I type. All right, that's really weird. I'm gonna do something here just to test this, sort of outside of this, because I know that a text input should work. So maybe I can just add one right here into my can I add one easily? I don't want to add an attribute. I'll edit as HTML. So I'm going to add one right here. Input type equals text. And just so I know that this one is the input I want, value equals spiffy. Give it some value to start with. All right. I can never remember how to get out of this and have it save my changes when I do that. All right, let me do it again. It didn't save it. All right, so let's check this. Well, I've got an input here. And sure enough, if I type into it, it works just fine. So that's really interesting. Why is my other input not changing when I type into it? Because it's just, if I go over here and look, it's rendering a HTML input. And it's got some empty value here of some kind. And that's because React does something quite interesting, which is they want to control the rendering of your components and not let you control them when you're working with them inside of React. So let me see here. I think I have to have this line to make this work. And I'll explain it in just a minute. I presume this will make it work. Oh wait, hold on. That's not right. No, yeah, I think it will be. Let's try this. Let's re-render. Is it going to work? Let me try and refresh. We'll see. Nope. All right, I have something wrong here. Hold on. My logic is wrong.
That example didn't have a value, did it?
Yeah, it didn't. That might be it. Actually, that is it for sure. I think that was my problem originally too. Actually, I think if I get rid of this, I think we're good too. And I can type, right? Thanks for catching that. Yeah, I wasn't even thinking. But you notice if I had a value there, just a value, right? Get rid of everything else. Go back to what I started with. Then it renders without it, and if I type, I get nothing. Like nothing shows up. And can anyone can anyone try and explain that? Anyone have a guess as to why that's happening? What's going on? Why it could be happening? So what's going on is React has rendered all of this application, right? And when React renders, let's look at our render here for our app. We don't even have to dive down into everything. We render a div, which has a button and a button. And we render an input, which has a value of nothing. And React tries to own any portion of the application that it renders. And so when you change stuff inside of that portion of the application, React essentially re-renders that portion of the application, right? It's like your data changed, I need to re-render. And yet we're not doing anything with the value that we, like the keystrokes here, but we're assigning a value. So essentially every time React re-renders, because we're not giving it any value that has meaning or anything beyond just this empty value, it's essentially re-rendering and giving us an empty value back. And we should be able to see that. Let me see if I can show that. If we say highlight updates, it's not going to show it, I don't think. That's just, I guess, because we don't have anything hooked up, right? Because we give it a value. Just by giving it a value, React is going to control that component. Control it. So in a normal web browser, if you have some sort of input box and you're working with it and you're changing values in it and typing, if you want to read what that input box has, or you want to process it in some way, you want to do something when somebody has added a character into it, you sort of have to look at it after it's changed, right? You can say like, oh, on key down, maybe do something. But really what you're doing is saying, oh, this text box has some text in it. Let's read what's in there and do something now. But React has the notion of, are these controlled components instead of uncontrolled? And what that means is just like, you know, in our app here, there's no real way to do anything to change this note directly, right? Instead, we have to pass in new properties to it to change it. So a controlled component operates the same way. It can't change itself, even if it would normally be able to take some type of input. Instead, something new has to get passed in to tell it to re-render and change itself, and then it can change. But until you do that, it's not going to change at all.
So that's control.
That's what a controlled component is, which means you end up with this very interesting cycle. So let's turn this into a controlled component. And because I don't want to create a whole component, normally you would have it maybe be separate and you would pass it in as a prop, so it would re-render off props. But I'm going to use state at least first, just because it's a little easier here. So let's give this guy a value, and let's say his value is based off our state instead of something else, right? So our value is this dot state dot, we'll just call it input. So that'll be our property. And if we go over here and look, and we'll re-render, we can see it has nothing in there right now. And can I look at the console? We'll pull it up, come on. What's going on? That's weird. All right, go to my console. There we go. Is wrong. Just a minute. That should not be accepting input. Oh, it's because I don't have any value. It's because since there's no actual input here, it sees this as undefined, which is the same as not having real value. So let's go up to the top here where we've initialized our state. And let's add an input along with our notes here. Let's start with Spiffy. So now it should actually have a value in it. Renders. There we go. And you can even see it's trying to help me out here. We've got a nice big warning over here. Uh-oh, you provided a value prop to a form field without an on-change handler. That makes your input read-only. You're never going to be able to change the value in it. And sure enough, again, like before when I gave it an empty string value, I can't change it at all. And that's because React is controlling it instead of us being a controlled component. So anything I do is not going to directly change this. It'll still fire events, but it won't put that input into that text box. So, okay, we can fire an event. So what do we do then? Well, what you do is we should have, did I have an example in here of it? So I can just take it directly. If not, I'll use it from the other one, but no. All right, let me take it right from here. So we can do, let's just hook up to an event. So, okay, we want to capture key presses, right? So what maybe key press events? Let's just act like we don't know what we're doing here. Let's look at events. What DOM events exist? Oh, we don't want a DOM event. We want to, okay, well, let's see. What event names exist here? Oh, here's some that look like keyboard events. Got key down, key press, and key up. I don't know, let's try key press. That seems to sound like what I'm looking for. So basically, we want to capture this key press event. So we do something when a key is pressed. All right, well, I don't know exactly what I want to do yet, but I've got an example of my event object here. So let's go ahead and start creating a method on our object here that'll do something on key press. Handle input pressed or something. And we can just call it handle input. And it's going to take our event object because that's what would get called. And then we want to change our state. Now let's say we don't know the event object yet, so let's do this in a simple way, right? We want to create a new input. So var input equals changed text. I don't know. And then just like before, we can do this dot set state. I'm gonna inline it this time. Input is input, as opposed to creating a separate thing there. All right, so we created this handle input. Now let's hook it up. Key pressed equals this dot handle input. So that's going to get called when a key is pressed on this input. Uh-oh, I've done something wrong. Unknown property key pressed on input tag. Oh, okay. On change is what I need. So it's telling me don't use key pressed, use on change. The input is changed in some way. So this is where I'm going to have to check and see. Let's see here. I think they've got their documentation here talking about it, but maybe not. So we're going to try and figure this out, which we'll have an example over here in this editing notes, but we're going to act like we're figuring something out without that. So we want on change. On change, let's handle the input. All right. Oh, wait. It's not this dot. Oh, yeah, it's this dot handle input. Okay. So let's refresh this whole thing, see if we get there without errors. Looks good. And so when I pressed my first key, it just became changed text. But it's not the key I pressed at all that did that. Instead, what happened, the cycle there was I pressed a key, which caused the on-change event to fire for this input. The event that I have hooked up for that is handle input. Handle input changed the input value in our state to change text, and then React re-rendered our whole component, which re-rendered that input with the new text. So that's the idea of a controlled component. And we can work this a little more, and we can now we can say, okay, well, handle inputs are on change here. I'll need to check. I'm pretty sure it'll have the example right here. Hold on. So I think value is probably the new value. Not here. So what's actually getting fired here? Let's just log this event and find out what happens. All right, so we'll re-render. I'll click this. We'll get our event here. Oh, I hate you, React. This is where I get burned by React. All right. I'm gonna get burned here. This won't give me what I want. Handler, target, blah, blah, blah. I don't know what the new value is off the top of my head. Event.value is probably what I want. So what I probably want here is input equals this.state.input plus event.value. Or maybe I just want event.value because I just changed it. I'm going to try that first and we'll see. Uh-oh, app is changing a controlled input of type text to be uncontrolled. How did it change it?
Event.target.
Think so? I don't know. That was weird. What?
Under the forums for React.
I always see. Sometimes that. There we go. It's all happy now. It was upset before. I don't write these all the time, so I always have to look up the references myself too. Like if it was me, I probably would have taken another 15 minutes looking up, trying to make sure I get the syntax right. I don't quite know what I'm looking for. Yeah, happens to you all the time when you're working on stuff. But the idea here is there's two separate ways to manage this element, right? So we've got this input element, but the input element isn't changing itself like it normally is in an HTML document. So normally if you're typing into an input, it's just capturing that and changing and doing that input. But with a controlled component, it doesn't actually change the element first. Instead, you tell React, oh, something changed, and React re-renders it with the new input. And the idea there is it just allows you, it's like it said, controlled. It allows you to control the changes so that we could have a ton of additional logic around that says like, oh, if they type these things, don't change it. Or if you're in this other state, don't change that value. And it also gives you, lets React manage the inputs so that it's doing all the hooking up into it as opposed to you having to hook up to the inputs direct or read from those values and let the browser change those outside of React. And pretty sure that wasn't as clear as I would have liked, but just trying to present this idea of controlled inputs or whatever for this editing and notes section, because it, like I said, sort of gloss over it, but it's a pretty cool concept of this idea of that input is like not changing itself. Like even if we just changed our handle input here so that we didn't do anything, or just let's comment out our set state so we don't change our state, then we go back to, hold on, maybe it's still broken. We go back to the situation where nothing we do changes our inputs.
It does, right?
Yeah, it's firing the event because I still have the event here. But then what happens is it fires this event, it processes it, and then it says, oh, my state didn't change. I don't even, that's why it wasn't re-rendering before, because it sees that nothing that could impact that input element changed, so it doesn't need to change. So here it's doing the same thing again. Like if we were to look at the, go over and look at our React tab here and say highlight changes while we're working in here, then you can see it's nothing's flashing. Whereas if I do like this, you can see sort of everything that flashes to say that's what's being re-rendered, which is really cool to do if you guys are, you know, wanting to learn, is get the React Developer Tools extension and you can see certain things like this, like highlight what is changing whenever something changes, and it shows you all the bits and pieces that React is re-rendering. Like if I delete this guy, okay, all of this re-rendered, everything re-rendered. But why? That's a good question.
Set state is really good.
The reason is because the state is at the app level, and the app is re-rendering everything. So if the state was managed somewhere else,
Oh,
if that state was managed at a lower level, then not everything would get re-rendered, because it would re-render just the level from there and below. Yeah.
that makes
Yep. But React is smart enough to see that nothing changed in your state with this. You can change your rendering, so it doesn't even bother to re-render anything. Even though it fires the events, it says, nothing changed in the state. Don't update anything. It's weird. Does that make sense for people? Yeah?
Does,
Yeah.
does uncontrolled and controlled only apply to inputs or everything?
That's a good question. I think it applies to anything that would be some form of input that takes user input of some kind, as being a controlled or uncontrolled component. So other things it doesn't directly apply to in the same way, I believe. But yeah, anything that takes user input. So that's mostly the input element, but there are a few other things you could do. So like you could do a, let's do this here as an example. If I made my notes content editable, I don't know if this is going to work or not. Let's see if this works. Okay, you want the uppercase, that's fine. So then these can be like changed, I think now. Let's see. They'll probably yell at me still. So you can make changes to this because they're not inputs. I think it's only inputs, I guess. But the problem with my changes to this is they're not being managed by React. And what that means is, okay, I just changed this text, right? Let me click this new colors button here. Oh, yeah, because React is very smart. It's gonna work better than I planned. Great.
Wait, so I've never seen that content editable.
Don't do it. It's a minefield of horrible things.
But it just like you change the node without even having to do the like whole editable step.
Yeah, content editable. Except the truth is I didn't. Okay, let me find a better example. This doesn't cause it to change. It's really weird that that doesn't do that. How can I?
What about just like a div with some letters?
Well, it's sort of weird that it doesn't re-render stuff. That's React doing some very. I don't like what it's doing there. Component is content editable and contains children managed by React. Can I find a better way to? This is React's diffing engine that allows this to smoothly do this when normally it wouldn't. So you're not guaranteed. I guess what I'm getting at here is this what's happening here is none of this is being captured by React. And so if it actually re-rendered this completely, it could just blow away everything that I just typed in there right now. Now it didn't, and that gets into what React is actually doing under the covers that you probably don't need to know about, you know. But that's why. Content editable is an HTML thing. You can pretty much add it to any text area, and then you can change it and edit text and do all sorts of powerful things. You can even make stuff like bold or like italic. And it's part of the HTML spec, but it's also very, very flaky. So most of the text editors that exist traditionally, like if you've ever added a text editor to a web page, you've ever seen one, you know, probably the most famous one for those is like CK editor, is on a whole bunch of web pages. And it's a, oh shoot, they're gonna have their new one up now instead, but CK editor 4, like this is just a big content editable section, but it's very, very hard to work with, and it's not standard across browsers. So there's tons of quirks and issues and challenges with using content editable. So the people behind React, actually Facebook, created a separate way to create areas of a document that can be edited. What's it called? Like Draft.js, which is their own replacement, which acts a lot more like a managed component where everything that you type is managed and directly changing a state somewhere that just re-renders that area. And then you don't have most of the problems that come with the content editable. Well, great. I have not been sharing my screen, apparently.
Your face on it.
Hope people like to see my face. Yeah. So I wouldn't try and use content editable. You can look into it, but it's very hard to use effectively. I don't even remember what I was trying to show with that now. I went down a whole sidetrack. You were just asking a question about managed components, I guess, right? And inputs.
It does control and uncontrolled.
Yeah, so I think it's only tied to inputs. I think it only directly automatically manages input elements. Funny, it doesn't even have a mention here about it, but this is what it pushes back to. Yeah. I don't know, you can dig into it more, but I think it really only works with inputs. All right. Well, I want to leave time. I know there were some people who still had some issues with stuff and might want some time working through them. So I think that's about where we'll get today. I might post a video over the weekend stepping through the rest of the editing a notes section just to try and keep people on track so they don't feel like they're falling too far behind. Maybe I'll have to repost this if it was just on my face the whole time. But we'll see. And then yeah, just stay at it. We don't have any class on Saturday. But keep working towards getting through this. Sounds like some people are starting to get through the whole first section and getting into the flux area, which is awesome. So over the next couple classes, hopefully we'll be able to get through editing a note and then deleting a note. Then we'll have, I think, just styling a note, which maybe isn't a full class, we'll see. And then we'll get into the flux section and start being able to move stuff back and forth from different columns. And then it'll start really taking shape into a really awesome app. I think that's it for like the, talking